Welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Ryan Craven, and our guest today is CedarBough Saeji. CedarBough is talking to us all about K-pop and the social impact and influences that it can have. CedarBough is a visiting assistant professor in East Asian languages and cultures at Indiana University. She has previously held positions at University of British Columbia, Korea University, and Hankook University of Foreign Studies. A scholar of Korean performance who approaches issues from gender to cultural policy through examining everything from traditional mass dance dramas to the latest K-pop hits. CedarBough, thanks for being here today. Well, I think like a lot of folks that recently discovered K-pop, I had no idea anything about it until relatively recently. And it all of a sudden became something that it's a conversation and people should be taking aware of it. So can you is that surprising to you? Is that a new thing, or is that just a new awareness that's hitting us here?
We've seen a huge increase in awareness of K-pop in the past approximately 3 years in America. And so actually the K-pop industry has been trying to break into America for basically the entire history of K-pop. And it was repeatedly, each attempt was a little bit more successful than previous attempts. But with BTS, things have really sort of catapulted to a new level. And that has brought a lot more awareness with the American audience. And we've really seen people become fascinated by all of the different types of cultural products that are coming out from Korea. So BTS can be your sort of entryway to, the fact that there are many other groups and there are other really fabulous, media products, particularly coming out of Korea.
So K-pop was almost kind of the jump start, kind of the beginning of the funnel, potentially that lifeline to kind of more exposure to some of that media.
Well, I mean, for certain people, right? So it's there's certainly been time periods when Korean film looked like it was going to take off in the West, and there have been obviously Korean films like Parasite that have made a really large impression on foreign audiences. But right now, we just have a lot of different structural conditions. So it's not just about K-pop, it's also about things like Netflix becoming heavily invested in Korean cultural content. And that means that there are more Korean movies and more Korean television shows that are available on a platform that many Americans already subscribe to.
Gotcha. Has K-pop always had a little bit of a global influence? Was that kind of some of the intent behind it originally, or is that just also kind of a new growth trend?
Well, if we actually look at the history of popular music in Korea, it's heavily indebted to American musical trends. And that is something that's not just in the time period that we normally call K-pop, which most historians of Korean popular music would say that K-pop started in 1992. But even before that time period, American influence was really large. So between approximately 1945, after the end of the Pacific War, and 1988, the top selling music in Korea was not Korean music. So these Western musical recordings kind of came in with the American GIs who were stationed in Korea, and their radio station, of course, was one of now there was an earlier Korean radio station under the Japanese colonial government, but after the Japanese lost the war and went home, then when radio broadcast started up again, then what we have is we have the AFKN radio, and that's broadcasting to anybody nearby, regardless if they're American GIs or not. And so people were exposed to American music through that. And of course, there were music magazines and local performers who, partially because of their live performances for American GI audiences, were adapting Western and American musical trends, and then they would bring it back to their Korean audiences as well. At that point, of course, it has become, translated into Korean. And when they were performing it for the GIs, then it was really more like a straight up cover. And American music has been tremendously influential all the way through. And so when we talk about something like Dynamite, which was BTS's big hit in 2020, and we're like, oh, look, it's disco. Well, Koreans were also making disco in 1970, right? So, so Koreans have been making disco at the same time periods that Americans were making disco. And in particular, there are many scholars like Crystal Anderson who have delved into how much Korean music actually owes to African American musical forms.
Fantastic. And it's always interesting to me that when we start having these conversations to just learn more about how different cultures influence each other, especially in music. I mean, that's all over the place. But how that influence even begins, and in this case, it's just kind of the proximity to, a radio station. So that's very interesting. So one of the things that, kind of getting into a little bit more contemporary stuff that's been happening is, the K-pop influence on kind of the global political scene, and is that more just the fan base being engaged, or kind of what maybe led to that? If you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, from the Korean fandom within Korea, we have some trends that begin over time, including Korean fans historically would send gifts to the idols, and they would send these gifts kind of like tribute to the idols. And of course it would be things like teddy bears, but also pool your money and buy a luxury watch for somebody that you really love, that kind of thing. And at a certain time period, it just became too much for the idols. And at the same time that they're getting just too many teddy bears, and they end up having to throw away these teddy bears because, like, how many do you need? At the same time that that's happening, there's also a lot of criticism of these popular music fans. And part of that's the same sort of thing that you see in the West, where the interests of young people, particularly young women, are often discounted. And so there's this sort of, oh, look at them. They don't care about real things. They're not putting their energy in the right way. And so what happened is a redirection of that tribute being sent to the idols towards social causes. So instead of donating to buy a luxury watch for an idol, let's put our money together to donate a bunch of rice to a old folks home, or to an orphanage, or something like that. And so there's been all kinds of things, reforestation projects, projects to support education for, at-risk or low-income youth, things like that. So it's been absolutely beautiful to see the different ways that K-pop fans have learned to remake the image of fandom and also show love to the stars that they adore so much, but without burdening them with something they don't need, which is, too many teddy bears. And so when we have K-pop fandom slowly growing internationally, for many years, this was slowly evolving, and international fans would follow kind of like the trends that the K-pop domestic fans had demonstrated to them, the ones in Korea. And so when we get to the present moment, then there is a culture within K-pop fandom of putting our money together and doing something meaningful that that particular idol is going to appreciate. So, for example, perhaps donating money to the school, the middle school that somebody graduated from. Or recently, one of the BTS members is known to support Unwed Mothers Association in Korea. And so for his birthday, the fans pooled their money and sent it through an organization called One in an Army. They pooled their money and sent it to this Korean Unwed Mothers Association to support these single moms. And so last summer, we start to see that coming to the attention of the international news media and the American news media, because we see things like donations happening to Black Lives Matter. But again, this is being organized by fans, and it's being organized by fans partially with a mindset of how can we show that fandom is healthy and connected to society, and that fans care about larger issues, and how can we also make our beloved idols look good, so it reflects back on the idols what the fans are doing. And so, $1 million going to Black Lives Matter, organized again by One in an Army last summer. It's just absolutely beautiful to see that kind of social engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a kind of a, what I'm trying to think here. The social impacts, kind of like a crowdsourced social impacts almost, spurred by just kind of love of music, love of a particular idol, and having its own kind of established community that is moved in that direction.
Well, I think in the case like with Black Lives Matter, you have to remember that so many of the people who are K-pop fans are also minorities themselves, African American, Asian American, they might be LGBTQ. These are people that, for whatever reason, have plenty of social issues that they are also concerned with. They aren't only K-pop fans. They're also young people or older people in America today who can see problems in society and have some viewpoints on it. And of course, what we see in the case of K-pop fans and their international activities is that they tend to come down more on the liberal political end of the spectrum. But at the same time, what kind of a person becomes attracted to a cultural product from a different culture, in a different language, and is willing to open their heart to something that's so unlike whatever is in their home? And so I do think that K-pop fans, no matter what country you're talking about, K-pop fans are more likely to be open-minded and interested in worldwide issues of, justice and equality and all that kind of stuff. And so that makes it so that, we do end up seeing, not just in America, but also K-pop fans taking action recently politically in Indonesia, in Thailand, and also getting involved in large-scale donations in other countries like India in response to, natural disasters. So it's certainly, kind of on the liberal end of the political spectrum, but by and large, the actions that fans are taking are more about social issues than about political issues. Like, if you really think about it, they're looking at racial justice, or they're looking at, issues of inequality in society in terms of access to education, or, prejudice against people based on their gender identity or their sexuality. And so it is, in the one case last summer, we did see some K-pop fans getting involved in, kind of punking Trump in his registering for the rally in Tulsa but not showing up. But in general, what we're seeing is action on causes which could be called more social than political.
Yeah, and a lot of those social causes have been politicized and kind of using them in that way. And it's interesting to see. Would you say that the more common avenue, the more common trend is that the more common action, I guess I should say, is more supportive, giving back versus, like you said, the Trump rally. We're gonna buy a bunch of tickets and not really go. That seems more of a statement and a negative action versus a donate, giving a donation or something along those lines.
Yeah, in general, K-pop fans though are accustomed to doing things like getting tickets to make points or buying additional copies of a CD that you already own to achieve a certain metric. And so I think that adapting those same techniques that are already used to the Tulsa rally was not that surprising.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. I think one of the things that really interests me about the whole conversation, and this has been eye-opening for me, is I'd be curious as how much of the interest and focus on kind of the social impact and the social engagement piece is just more. It's kind of becoming more of a global trend, right? Even company like just businesses in general in the U.S. Like there's been all this rallying, kind of almost against like, well, why should we care? We're a business, we don't need to care about social issues. It's like, well, but your customers are, and your business practices reflect that. And so if you do really espouse to X, Y, or Z, like you need to kind of start showing that and paying attention to that. And I wonder how much of that's a generational thing, or just everybody's really starting to recognize that, oh, these are things that we should care about. Nobody else is going to fix it. But we need to start holding each other and others accountable.
I think in the world today, we have the ability to quickly and easily find out about some of these interconnections. And in the past, you could be supporting a company and you might not know what subsidiaries that company had or what international actions they were taking. Now, youth today, they know they can Google up that information. It won't take them that long to uncover what other connections there are. So where your money actually is going. And I think that a lot of young people today understand that some of these simplistic political approaches where politicians try to kind of play one group of people against another end up coming back to bite you in the wrong way. So at the time that we're recording this is just a couple of days after the shooting in Atlanta. And obviously, a lot of the ratcheting up of attacks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is directly connected to the rhetoric of a Chinese virus, this blaming and allowing people's frustration with the pandemic to be pinned onto China. But then there are so many people that can't even tell the difference between one group of East Asians and another group of East Asians. And so if you create this sort of rhetoric, or earlier, if you create rhetoric about how China is stealing American jobs, then if you create that kind of rhetoric, then it's not surprising to see an American whose family came from Japan ending up, the victim of an attack by people who are angry about their American jobs being taken. When, today's youth, I think, aren't able to easily fall for that kind of false narrative and are able to say, like, wait a second, it's American companies that are choosing to move their factories overseas and to invest in various ways that actually take the jobs out of America. And so it's actually corporate greed that's to blame. It's not, some foreign country that, welcomed those jobs. I mean, why shouldn't they welcome those jobs? They're trying to support their people, So I do think it's a different moment than the past when a corporation could just say, you like our product, so buy it. And you would never actually know what they were doing with the profits from your purchase.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, that information's out there now, right? And everybody has a camera. And I think to your point, more and more individuals as a whole, but also just companies, like your actions have consequences, and you have to be ready to really own that, because it's really easy to show your actions to the world now. Everybody's got a camera.
Right.
So,
And we do need to think about, like, what are we supporting? What kind of industries are we supporting? And so, we, of course, we can take that all the way to when we support some sort of media products from Korea. What sort of country is that? What sort of government is that? And what sort of companies are those performers working for? Like, who is this director of this movie, and do I want to support this person? And it's been really interesting to see the way that K-pop fans also will get invested into those sorts of issues with BTS is always a good example. It was about 3 years ago now, BTS was planning to have a very famous Japanese music video director get involved in producing and directing a video. And then fans found out that the man had very right-wing Japanese politics, which can be, anti-Korean. And, they were like, wait a second, like, we don't care how good his work has been with very famous Japanese pop groups. We don't need to have that kind of politics connected to, we don't need to support that kind of person, have them connected to BTS. And so, yeah, we do, I think, have a better understanding these days that everything is connected, that we do live in for lack of a better word, an ecosystem. And the media is also an ecosystem. So,
yeah, I would say one thing that in the various conversations I've had over this last year with COVID, our organization, we do a lot of work with just a wide range of people all across the world in different countries and whatnot. And it has certainly highlighted, in my mind, it's a globalized world. You really can't be in your own bubble, and what happens across the world has impacts here, and it spreads. It's just, that's reality now.
Yeah, the virus really has shown us how interconnected we are when we see how easily a variant can escape, from wherever it has been detected. So, with K-pop, there are definitely some complications with all of this that we have to think about. Like, K-pop is very, at this point, connected to Korean soft power. And of course, the government has a certain agenda. And the Korean government's agenda for accruing soft power through K-pop or other Korean media products is very different than international fandom's agenda. So, like, international fandom may think that it's tons of fun to punk a Trump rally, but that's not necessarily what the Korean government is going to feel comfortable with. And that's why I always try to be a little careful with talking about this stuff, because we do have to realize that the immediate response from the American right wing was, look, Korea's interfering in our elections. And it's like, actually, no, these are American fans in America who are, they're connected to Korea through love of a cultural product. And, this isn't foreign, but it can be perceived that way. Something that a K-pop fan does can be perceived as being connected to Korea. And so, the Korean government does have this very sensitive sort of line that they're walking, that they're threading with that. And a lot of the Korean media producers also have this very sensitive line where they want to attract an international audience, but they need to keep their Korean domestic audience, so they can't neglect the Korean domestic audience. And they want to demonstrate to the international audience that they are welcome within the world of K-pop and Korean media. But at the same time, they can easily make culturally insensitive decisions with that and get accused of, cultural appropriation or other sorts of insensitivity. There was a case not that long ago where Blackpink was recording a music video, and they had a very small statue of Ganesh, which is a Hindu god, within the music video. You could only see it for just the tiniest period of time, but it was down by one of the women's feet. And that was just not, acceptable. And so this isn't exactly cultural appropriation. Like, I truly believe that the company did that trying to connect to South Asian fans in whatever way. But it was extremely culturally insensitive, and it was really the wrong way to go about that connection. But we see that kind of thing happening in K-pop a lot, and that also can then reflect back on Korea. Like, what kind of culturally insensitive people are you? How do you not know about this? How can you not think this through? Like, who puts a god next to somebody's feet, And there was an even more recent case where a young woman the actual case came out recently, but it was actually last November. They were going to do filming, and they went to a site, and it was kind of like a private museum. And at this private museum, there was a mannequin, a male mannequin dressed up in, Hitler military uniform. And one of the women in the group, called G-Friend, sort of clowning around and posing together with this mannequin. And so, of course, the international fan reaction, particularly from Western fans, were, don't you know about World War II? Don't you know about Nazis? Don't you understand, like, the gravity of the Holocaust? Like, this is not, you can't just joke around with, a mannequin in this costume. So this international expansion might be great for making money. It might be great for raising Korea's profile in the world. Now, Korea is already one of the largest economies in the world. But of course, compared to their direct neighbors, China and Japan, then they're not that big, So, but still, they're in the top 15, like, no matter what year it is, they're always in the top 15. So it's a big economic country, but now they have this increase in visibility and people are paying attention. And with that comes these, complications. So, you got to be culturally sensitive. You got to think about who's watching all the time. And it's not just Korean eyes, and it's not just what's acceptable to a Korean audience. It's the world.
Yeah, and that can be, I think, said for really just about everybody, every group, every organization. If you're trying to, you have to do a little bit of research and get another pair of eyes on things. I mean, I don't know how many times, even just more recently, it's like, wait, you really said that? Or you really thought that was a good idea? Like, just having somebody else look at that would have caught that, or try and bring it, like, just do a little bit of research on the subject. And hopefully in that light, it kind of showcases, if you're going to try and incorporate those things or bring in or make that connection, like, you can't just throw a token out there. Like, if you're going to do it, you need to, it's on you to do the research and make it a meaningful statement instead of a quick a quick attention grab. And kind of
Right.
to your point, the younger generation knows that they can do that search, and it's easy to see like, oh, I know what you're doing. You're just throwing it in there hoping that I'll like it and support it versus, oh, you actually paid attention, did some homework, did the research, and actually are making a statement. Okay.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a way to engage with international cultures that demonstrates that you really care about them. And then there's just tokenism, you know? And that's definitely it's definitely a problem. People do try to cut these corners sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that conversation. That was extremely enlightening for me. I very much appreciate learning a little bit more about K-pop and kind of how the trend came about, and especially the interaction of the fandom. That is amazing.
Yeah, well, it's a really fascinating field to be working in right now. And I think it's also really worth acknowledging that the boom in K-pop interest during this pandemic could partially have been connected to how precious it is to sort of imagine a more perfect place in a time when the rest of us are going through a lot of stress and uncertainty. And so K-pop and Korean media has become sort of a bit of a fantasy escape world for some people these days. And so I just hope that in the future that all the new audience that they actually follow up and learn more about Korea and learn that it's more complex than just some of these fantasies.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. I appreciate it. That's it for this edition of Cyber Focus. For future topics or suggestions, please drop us a line at cyber@indiana.edu.